Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu have finally met, and this meeting seems to have eased the tension a little, but not completely. On July 28, a meeting took place in the Oval Office of the White House between US President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Formally, this is an ordinary visit of an ally, but in fact, it is the first in-person meeting between the two leaders since February 28, when they jointly began the war against Iran. Just think about it. They haven't met in person throughout the entire war against Iran. A lot has changed in the war over the past 5 months. The war, which they promised to finish in a couple of weeks, has dragged on. The relationship between Trump and Netanyahu has noticeably cooled, and the disagreements between them have become public. The significance of this meeting is that it is taking place at a time when the US and Israel see things completely differently about how to end the war against Iran and what means to use. In this episode, we'll break down what is known about the results of the in-person meeting between Trump and Netanyahu, what the Israeli and American media are writing, and why the right wing of Donald Trump's supporters is closely watching this meeting. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. We are approaching 300,000 subscribers, so I'd appreciate every subscription. So, according to the White House, the meeting started at 11:03 Eastern Time, right after the meeting between Trump and Zelensky, and lasted about an hour and a half. Netanyahu, as noted here, for example, Al Jazeera entered the White House through a side entrance in the West Wing without any formal ceremony. The talks were held behind closed doors, without the press, just like Zelensky's meeting with Trump. As I said in the previous episode, well, it's obvious that here at the White House they decided to hold these meetings behind closed doors so as not to distract attention from today's event, in particular, the farewell ceremony for the late Senator Lindsey Graham. Besides the leaders themselves in the Oval Office, judging by the photos distributed by Netanyahu's office, were present US Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Mark Rubio, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. By the way, this trio is very telling. The official assessments of the results are cautiously positive, let's put it that way. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt wrote the following in a brief post on X. President Trump has concluded his Oval Office meetings with President Zelensky and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Both meetings were positive and productive, period. And after that, an Israeli official, who is familiar with the course of the negotiations, repeated this assessment in a comment to CNN, calling the meeting, quote, very positive, conducted in a positive atmosphere, with senior members of the administration present. Neither the White House nor Prime Minister Netanyahu's office are disclosing any substantive details of these negotiations. And according to CNN, the parties discussed the war in Iran, the course of negotiations with Lebanon, and the expansion of the Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia. And here it's important to understand, why was this meeting between Trump and Netanyahu described as potentially tense in the first place? By the end of July, the rift between Trump and Netanyahu was no longer behind the scenes. Everyone was already talking about it openly. It got to the point where Netanyahu, let me remind you, a month earlier announced that Israel no longer needed any military aid from the United States of America. And Trump literally just said today that he doesn't need any data from Israel to strike, for example, at Mount Kirky in Iran. A few hours before the negotiations, Trump made it clear on Fox News that he is very skeptical of the Israeli Prime Minister's position. When it came up that Netanyahu is planning to present the American president with Israeli intelligence on Iran's underground nuclear facility, the so-called Mount Kirky, Trump responded, quote, I don't need Bibi to tell me that. We can handle it ourselves. Earlier, commenting on the disagreements over Iran, Trump put it this way, we have a small difference, but overall we're pretty close. And in the same conversation, Trump reminded Israel of its dependence on the United States of America, responding to Israeli objections to resuming the F-35 program with Turkey. Quote, Honestly, we are very kind to many countries. That wouldn't survive without us. And you know who wouldn't survive without us? Israel. The essence of the disagreement can probably be summed up in one paragraph, so that everything becomes clear and completely crystal clear. Netanyahu has advocated from the very beginning for continuing military actions against Iran and its ally Hezbollah in Lebanon. But he was sidelined after Trump began seeking a deal with Tehran. It was Netanyahu who convinced Donald Trump in February that the time had come for regime change in Iran. Well, 5 months later, the war is not over, and the hardline wing of the Iranian regime, if anything, has strengthened its position. And there's no talk of surrender now. And Trump is openly angry at Netanyahu because of this. How are Israeli media evaluating the meeting? Here, there's a separate and very telling story. I'll give you just a couple of quotes. The tone of this meeting is noticeably worrying. It's more worrying than the official tone in the Israeli media. For example, political analyst Amit Segal wrote the following in the newspaper Israel Hayom. The Americans are making it clear to the Israelis that they are the ones conducting the war. It's obvious to everyone that Israel has been made to take a back seat. Ma'ariv newspaper columnist Ben Caspet was even more outspoken. And he writes the following: "We lost America. Thank you, Bibi." This is about the perception that Israel has lost the initiative in the war, which in fact it itself initiated, and that its influence on Washington's decisions is diminishing. The additional background is the Associated Press poll data, which was published earlier in July, just a week ago, about a noticeable decline in support for Israel among adult Americans. In fact, the majority no longer supports Israel. But, to be honest, the domestic political context increases the vulnerability of both Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu is going for re-election this fall. His position is further complicated by worsening relations with Trump. Trump, in turn, is under pressure because of an unpopular war, which has dealt a blow to the economy and driven up prices on the eve of the congressional midterm elections. That is, for each of the leaders, this meeting was needed less for a breakthrough than to publicly show that relations, though not smooth, are definitely under control. Now let's talk about why the right wing of Trump's supporters, the MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, was watching this meeting between Netanyahu and Trump especially closely. The war with Iran has divided this coalition from the very beginning, and this division is fundamental. A significant portion of influential right-wing commentators are isolationists, who believe that voters supported Trump precisely because he promised not to involve the United States of America in foreign wars under any circumstances, not to start new wars, and to end as many wars as possible around the world, and overall to focus solely on domestic American issues. There's no need to pay attention to the rest of the world. Well, that's why they're called isolationists. The loudest voice in this camp is former Fox News host Tucker Carlson. Back in late February, during the war's first days, he made this statement, quote, "This happened because they wanted it. Israel, this is Israel's war. This is not the United States war." Carlson called the US military campaign based on lies and the result of Netanyahu's manipulation. Later, when Trump threatened strikes on Iran's civilian infrastructure, Carlson called it, quote, "a war crime." He was joined by other figures from the right-wing media sphere as well. These include Megyn Kelly, Candace Owens, and, for example, Alex Jones. These are also some of the most far-right representatives of the MAGA movement, and they all started criticizing Trump in unison. Among Republican politicians, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was previously one of Trump's most loyal supporters, consistently speaks out against supporting Israel and continuing the war. But, to be honest, she's a completely unhinged congresswoman who was shouting that there are Nazis in Ukraine, churches are being burned, and priests killed, in general. Plus, she also said this: "Not a penny in aid to Ukraine if Trump wins." Trump's own reaction to this criticism was harsh. For example, he publicly called Tucker Carlson, Kelly Owens, and Jones, this group of four, quote, people with low IQ, and claimed that MAGA, by contrast, supports his agenda. Quote, MAGA wants our country to prosper and be safe. And MAGA loves what I do. I do. The administration's position in this internal dispute is articulated by J.D. Vance, and it's conflicted. On the one hand, he's one of the few in Trump's circle who, in recent weeks, has been willing to criticize Israel. On the other hand, it was Vance who had previously directly warned Israeli officials that Donald Trump is, quote, the only world leader sympathetic to Israel. And he reminded them that 2/3 of the defensive weapons protecting their homeland were built by Americans and paid for by American taxpayers. Well, even criticism from the White House sounds more like a reminder to Israel of its dependence rather than a shift in policy. And Netanyahu can't hide it. Well, although after meeting with Trump, he said it was his best meeting with a US president. What does all this mean for each side? For Israel, the key outcome lies not in specific agreements, but in a confirmed fact. Israel is no longer the leader, but the follower in this war, which it started itself. Netanyahu came to offer intelligence and to convince Donald Trump that he would not interfere with American diplomatic efforts in the Gaza Strip and with the investments, where Trump previously complained that, quote, too many people are dying in Gaza. The positive framing of the meeting allows Netanyahu to save face within Israel itself before the elections. But it does not change the fact that strategic decisions regarding Iran are now made exclusively in Washington. For the United States, the meeting fits into Donald Trump's strategy of ending the war on his own terms. Let me remind you that the day before, on July 24, Trump cancelled the plans, as he put it, for a massive attack on Iran. And his generals, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Dan Kane and Commander of Central Command Admiral Brad Cooper, warned about the depletion of interceptor stockpiles and the limits of bombing effectiveness. In this context, Trump's restraint toward Netanyahu is quite logical. The continuation of the war in Israel's interest contradicts both the military capabilities of the United States and the domestic political costs for Trump. Overall, their goals have begun to diverge sharply. For Iran, the public discord between Washington and Jerusalem is rather a favorable factor. The more obvious the disagreement between the allies on the issue of escalation, the less likely an immediate new strike becomes, and the more room there is for delay. Which, judging by Tehran's behavior, the Iranian leadership was counting on. What's next? Well, as I see it, the first scenario is maintaining the current pause in strikes against Iran while continuing economic pressure and negotiations through intermediaries, with Israel playing the role of junior partner. The second scenario is if negotiations with Iran break down and Trump considers it politically necessary to demonstrate strength, possibly a return to strikes. And then the position of Netanyahu, who advocates a hard line, once again coincides with the actions of the United States of America. By election time, he'll be back on top. Overall, it's perfect for him. The third option is further cooling if Israel takes some independent steps, which Washington will consider as undermining its diplomacy. Which of these scenarios will come true largely depends on what exactly was discussed behind closed doors. And this is something the parties have not disclosed yet. Bottom line, the meeting between Donald Trump and Netanyahu on July 28 was officially described as positive and productive. It lasted about an hour and a half and took place with no details made public. Behind this wording of a positive and productive meeting lies a real cooling of relations between the two allies and, importantly, a change in roles. Israel, which started the war against Iran, ended up in the background, which Israeli commentators openly admit. For Donald Trump, the war has become, in my opinion, a domestic political problem and a source of division within his own camp, where influential right-wing voices are demanding not to get even more involved in this war. Apparently, the meeting was necessary for both leaders, primarily to demonstrate control over the situation to their voters, and not to announce some new common policy. No one denies that there are disagreements, but it was necessary for Bibi to show his voters and for Trump to show his that, look, yes, there is a conflict, but everything is under control, everything is manageable, and there will be no problems. And we need to understand that the real direction of the war in the Middle East will be determined not so much by the results of these negotiations, but by whether the United States of America and Iran will be able to reach a lasting agreement on the Hormuz Strait and the nuclear program. That is much more important. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like this video. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.